Sam Tannenhaus, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
It seems from what has been said, has been what you all have studied, that there's a need now to go from the national review to a global review. Their kids in China, India, are at stake, not just ours.
It's true. It's absolutely true. You know, I was reminded when we were talking about Iraq, it wasn't just Americans who got killed there.
Yeah.
In Vietnam, we talk about the 58,000 Americans who were killed, but there were a lot more Vietnamese who were killed. You're absolutely right. And that's where, if I understand where I think you may be headed, that's where kind of an America first
To the
politics.
United Nations.
It's a real issue. Now, he did say, who was it who said that looks like he's good with NATO? Isn't it so funny that we have to, who? The president said it. Yeah, he said we seem to be good with NATO, which is, it's a remarkable thing to hear said, and yet we kind of, it's a relief. It's important that it be said. But of course you're right. That's where most of the population is in those other countries. That's always the problem with American politics, and not just American politics. It's true of the Brits, it's true of the French, it's true of the Germans. Everybody looks inside. I think the only story is about them. I write for a British publication. I write a lot for a magazine called Prospect. It's not like the New Republic. It's published over there. And it's Brexit, Brexit, Brexit. They got interested in Donald Trump after Brexit, because we have the paradox, and I've written about this, the paradox of a xenophobic leader who is now a global spokesman for this movement, this national sovereignty, and I don't know what you think of all that, but there's a way in which he's actually part of a tide of kind of national sovereignty, ethnically.
Sure, I think there's no doubt about that, and there's no doubt that, even Hillary Clinton eventually, over the course of the campaign, came to be much more accepting of the idea that globalism and some of the free trade agreements had dimensions to them that were not completely successful. Of all the serious challenges to Washington orthodoxy, where that's one of the most significant ones, where Republicans and Democrats had both arrived at this idea that these giant global trade agreements were in the end good for everybody, and almost beyond reconsideration or adjustment, and when clearly they're not, or clearly they have, like everything massive, there are always unintended consequences, and the idea that that globalism is something that has set a lot of people on edge around the world, and the EU was always a fairy tale idea. If you spend any time there in Europe in the 90s, the notion that the English were really going to, particularly when freedom of mobility finally came into play. Digressing, but I happened to be in Austria, and I spent a lot of time in Austria and Germany and old Yugoslavia in the 90s, and I was in a friend of mine's house in Graz, Austria, the second city of Austria, a couple of months after the EU education provisions first went into place, which at that point you still didn't have freedom of mobility. You couldn't move anywhere within the Union, but you could enroll at university anywhere in the Union. And the Austrians, who I love, and I once was in love with for a long time, an Austrian woman, until she fell in love with an Austrian man.
We finally get to an interesting topic here. Don't tell us you're going to cut that off.
That's sort of the end of the story.
What we're here for.
That's the end of the story, brother, sadly. But happily for me, it worked out. But I happened to be there when the education provisions went in, and the Austrians are a little bit of a slower moving people than the Germans. And all of a sudden, they looked up, and Germans had taken all the spaces in Austrian professional schools, particularly the law schools. And so all of a sudden, there was a year in which no Austrians got into law school because Germans had taken all the spaces. And they were all up in arms about it. And they were up in arms about that they had to institute standardized tests for the first time. And so there were all these kinds of impositions coming from the the centralized European government, that was long before financial integration, and it was obvious that this is just not going to go very well. And then I was in Germany just a couple of years ago when the first Syrian refugees began to arrive in little towns out in rural places, and boy, I said to the B&B innkeeper I was staying with at one point out in Schwabing, which is about as redneck a place as you can get in the world, and I said, this is the end of Angela Merkel right here. We're watching the beginning of the end right here, and that was 2 years ago. But these global considerations are very real.
I have been very deeply upset about this whole election process in this last year, and I know many people in this room probably feel the same. I am discouraged about the lack of ethics on both sides of the fence. So I have two questions. One is, does the American public have the realistic expectation, to have that expectation, that someone, quote unquote, decent will run for office regardless of party? Is that the concept of ethics and politics truly dead more than conservatism? And does Donald Trump possess the strength of character necessary to build unity and to be a moderator?
Well, one thing that we're all going to be thinking about, reflecting on, always happens when presidents leave office, they start looking better. We had 8 years of a really dignified, right, decent man and family in the White House, and we forget, we took it for granted. A former colleague of mine, David Brooks, started writing about this, if any of you read him, a while ago. This was somebody who was absolutely above reproach. One of the reasons the election was mystifying, there was a very interesting story that Times ran from a good reporter, Sabrina Tavernese. Right after the election, she talked to people in Ohio, and many of them had voted for Obama in 2008, and some again in 2012, and still liked him and voted for Donald Trump, because they just saw Hillary Clinton as a different kind of person. They really liked him. They weren't punishing him. They were ready to try someone different. But I think his sense of, the intellect he brought to politics, the humor and wit. I remember when he had to do the first sparing the turkey in his very first Thanksgiving. Remember? And he said something like, well, there are some reasons you want to be president, and then there's this. And he just made a joke about it that any kind of normal person would. And I think we're going to remember that the president we just had embodied a lot of those virtues. So we shouldn't fear that we won't see somebody like that come along again. It's partly, Doug will want to weigh in this too, it's partly this whole social media thing we had too. Look at where Facebook ended up in all of this now. Now here we are doing a Facebook program, but there were complications with that about using algorithms to determine what stories would run. Twitter became this kind of weapon in our politics that nobody was really prepared for. Those things are maybe more important changes in the way we live our lives than the differences between the two parties. And I don't know what the answer is to that. How do we get a dignified people running for office again?
Well, I think you're right that it is important to remember how dignified the President and Mrs. Obama have been. I mean, it is quite remarkable. And it's also important to remember that there have been, a lot of really great leaders have been people who, in their personal lives, did things that were really objectionable. It's just that now we know a lot more about it. I mean, it was absolutely the idea that Hillary Clinton was attacked for the indiscretions or worse of her husband, the idea that any woman would be prevented from a great, highly accomplished woman, or anyone for that purpose, but that a spouse would be denigrated for the terrible behavior of his or her spouse. I mean, that's shocking and abominable. There's no other way to say it. That was just an abominable sort of claim. At the same time, Bill Clinton did things. I was a young reporter in Little Rock, Arkansas, when he was governor of Arkansas, and Bill Clinton did a lot of abominable things in his private life. There's no doubt about it. Folks here have heard me joke about that. I was always concerned I might end up dating the same woman as Bill Clinton back in those days. And as far as I know, I never did. But so now we know about these things. I will tell you that I think Donald Trump may represent. There's never the last of anything, but he, just like the Bill Clinton experiences and the Gary Hart experiences, actually were chastening moments in our national life when, for the first time really in American history, American men, of course all men are pretty terrible deep down, but American men saw powerfully that if you want to have a life in public life, that there are certain arrogant behaviors that actually aren't acceptable anymore and that will come back to haunt you. Donald Trump wasn't engaged in public life early enough to perhaps have curbed himself based on those lessons. But I actually think that you can look at it the other way and say that the election of President Obama and the circle of people who surrounded him speak to actually a higher character of national leaders and maybe that becomes more a broader phenomenon.
Interesting factoid that somebody sent me that maybe you all have seen. George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump were all born the same year, 1946, which is actually the beginning of the baby boom generation. And so maybe what we're seeing, pains me to say, I'm probably not the only baby boomer in the room, is maybe we're seeing with Trump the end of that. Too. Technically Obama belongs to the baby boom because it goes from 46 to 64. But if you were born at the end of it, you're really part of a different cohort. So in a way,
that's me, 64.
64, right? Okay. So it's interesting that decade. This kind of thing interests me. I don't know if it does anyone else. Do you know which recent decade never elected a president? There's no member of the 1930s. No one born in the 1930s was ever elected president. John McCain was the last hurrah, and he lost, of course. But it never happened, although there were some major politicians who came out of that decade. The 40s, those are people who came of age in the 60s. And wherever they happened to be, there was a sense of dynamism and leadership. But the opposite, some people have said the ungreatest generation. I think Christopher Buckley calls them, who came of age then. But that's one reason we see a lot of this stuff that's haunting us still, is because it was a different era they came out of. And the questioner's point about unifying the country, he doesn't come before us as Mr. Unity, that's for sure. So we just, that's worrisome. Can anybody unify this country? 323 million people?
The compeers of the presidential debates and the vice presidential debate, and possibly a bit yourselves, have neglected an important piece of globalization. You have to have a globe to globalize, and what about climate change? Because that is an important issue, not just for today, but for our future.
That's right. It is. Number of people have said that in some ways is the single biggest issue.
Well, you mentioned your interview with Noam Chomsky.
Yeah, and I was surprised because what Chomsky said was, I asked him, it was a very short thing that the Times asked me to do, a Q&A they put in their education section. And I was surprised he was highly critical of Jill Stein because he was afraid she was going to be the Ralph Nader of this election because of climate change. And she's a great advocate, by the way, of environmental health. For those of you who follow her, that's her great topic, and she's quite remarkable and impressive on it. But that's what was at stake. So here's Noam Chomsky saying, no, you've got to get behind the mainstream Democrat because this is a real issue. And the Paris Accords and all the rest, we don't really know, do we, what's going to come. Well, there was someone who was a close advisor early on who was very much a climate change denier.
Yeah, the person who's being talked about, I'm drawing a blank on his name, as the head of the EPA, is something of a climate change denier. Yeah, and which is, these are, if climate change is real, I think that most sensible people would say that it is. yeah, it's a very disconcerting moment. My father-in-law actually wrote the Clean Air Act. That's a fact.
Did he really?
He wrote the original Clean Air Act.
What year was that?
Well,
was
he
Nixon,
was.
wasn't it?
It was under Nixon, and he was the highest level non-presidential appointee in the EPA at the time.
There was more legislation passed under Nixon.
Yeah, exactly. The
Than
Clean Air
any
Act was passed
president
under
since.
Nixon. Yeah.
I once did a presentation. It was in Miami Book Fair, with a writer named Chris Hedges, if anybody knows the name, an extremely left-wing guy. And we agreed about, and it was right after this book came out, and we agreed about one thing, which is the last liberal president in America was Richard Nixon. All that affirmative action and the EPA, all this stuff got passed under him. Yeah.
Well, and it is possible, though, similar to Nixon, that that's actually an excellent sort of thing to zero in on, is that if Donald Trump were to get a hold of his narcissism and recognize that he actually has an opportunity to accomplish a great deal. I mean, Donald Trump could be a figure that, in a way, that we are at a state of polarization now, where this large population of disaffected folks out there who are looking for more things to be mad about, and so they're very ready to accept the Fox News idea that maybe climate change is not for real, and see that as something else to get mad about, and that must be the explanation for why they don't have jobs in the oil field anymore, or even though it was the Republicans 4 years ago who were running on I'm going to drive down the price of oil. But if Donald Trump were to become a voice of some sort of reasonable approach to global change in the environment, it's possible folks like that would that my cousin Ricky, if you're watching, Ricky, would be more open to the idea in a way that they never would be from Barack Obama. It's possible, but it's just a complete unknown. There's just no way to know.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever entered a period where we knew so little.
I thought both of you did a tremendous job on sort of understanding what the American spirit is really all about.
Thank you.
And it reminds me that we're in the American Forum, which was, in my opinion, named probably by Jerry Belials. He's a Democrat. On the other hand, I'm a libertarian. And my vote would be for Trump. But I'm thinking about the fact that he and I both went to a meeting once at Monticello. And you've heard this story so many times. A black historian spoke there. And after he spoke, and he did a marvelous job of his presentation, a spectator who was a black man with the NAACP got up and said, "I don't understand it. You're an African American. How come you're taking this position like you are?" And he said, "You ought to be back of us in doing the projects that we have." And he said, "I am not an Afro-American or an African American. I am an American."
Now, who said this?
This was a fellow, I think his name was, I can't remember his name now.
A black historian.
But a
Monticello.
historian.
Black
Yeah.
historian,
American
yes.
historian.
Very good black historian. There were only 3 whites in the room. The rest were blacks. He got his point across beautifully. And I think that's the reason you see the American Forum on the wall now.
Actually, I named it American Forum. It was the Miller Center Forum before I came along, but Jerry was the director of the Miller Center, so you're right about that.
My mother-in-law, who is a very good colonial historian, now retired, though still active, gave me a book to look at by Jackson Turner Maine about American politics, published in 1961. And she said, look how much geography is in it. It's a famous book about the anti-federalist movement. And it's about how, if you looked at tidewater, you could determine how people voted by how close they lived to navigable rivers, was one of his arguments. And I thought, and my mother-in-law, Patricia Barnum, a very good colonial historian, is very shrewd this way. She had me thinking in a different set of terms, and it has to do with things like geography. And, I would read some of the postmortems, these very bitter, disillusioned postmortems in New York publications, The New Yorker or New York Magazine, very excellent publications. And that at one way or another, one time or another, I've written for some of them. And there was so little talk of the country in it, so little discussion of where people live and how that forms who we are. That's the thing. It's not just that, not that everybody has to recite Walt Whitman, or for that matter, Bob Dylan, who's constantly writing about the landscape of America, from the far north in Minnesota that he came from, through New Orleans and California and Greenwich Village, all the places he lived in. It's the people who live in those places. And I really think somehow that got squeezed out. We were talking about America as if it really should be a small liberal arts campus in the Berkshires. You know, that's what it ought to be, and in some way that's really what it is. And it's a matter of, you know, who said that unpleasant thing to you in the seminar on you know, sexuality or gender or something 3 weeks ago, and how dare they say it? And that's how the nation had shrunk in this odd way. And for all the difficulties Trump presents, and they are enormous. I mean, we saw a lot of it. I mean, videos and transcripts, and I mean, you could follow him through, you know, Howard Stern. Forget all the other stuff. Somehow, he seemed to come more out of this idea, or to speak to it in some way. Even in the rallies he went to. Remember, he was ridiculed a lot at the end because they'd say, "Look, the polls have you losing." Right? And he would always say, "No, I'm going out there and the crowds are there for me." He'd exaggerate the size. The one I went to, he said, had 12,000 people when it had like 5,000 people. But the crowds were there. And there was something old-fashioned about that. The one thing I'll add to that, too, is when it's very easy to ridicule a phrase like "Make America Great Again," which he just absolutely plagiarized from Ronald Reagan, for one thing. But apart from that, it was easy to mock it because the response was always automatically, "Oh, make it great when?" You know, back when there was Jim Crow and all this stuff. All right, there's something to that. But if you look at an economist like Paul Krugman, who writes about, if you read his stuff, what does he say? He says America was at its best in 1963, right? Why? Why? Because we were in the beginnings of, it didn't quite become the Great Society. We had a government that looked out for us. That's the other way I would answer the question about what Donald Trump might get from my little book is, we do depend on the government. We look to it to help us and protect us. At the same time, we don't want to feel like we're clients standing in line, taking a number. It's a very delicate balance. That's where the libertarian argument is so powerful. And I say, don't forget Rand Paul. I wrote a very long story on him with our colleague Jim Rutenberg for the Times about Rand Paul when it looked as if he might be the new face of this. Don't forget that libertarian argument that says we're not just part of a group, we're not part of a cluster, we have our sense of individuality. Well, one reason we feel that is because so many forces encroach against us that seem to want to take it away from us.
As journalists, what do you think will be the effect on the media after this election? Will it change? What will happen? And the bullying that seems to be going, the failing New York Times?
Right, Rob? Well, I worked at the New York Times for quite a while, and they were very good to me. I do think there was a problem. I may be writing about this. I think it's a really complicated question. What happened, not just at the New York Times, the Washington Post and other publications as well. I think there was a disconnect between what the newspaper was doing. Now, I left in December 2014, so I was there through at that point. And since then, I've been writing a book and writing for many different places, including the New York Times. So I still feel a connection with them. But I do think there was a disconnect, and I do think there will be a period of soul searching.
A disconnect between whom and whom? Between
The paper and maybe some of its editors, though I couldn't say who in particular they were. It's a collaborative enterprise, as you know. Doug is a very distinguished journalist. And the public at large, and the voters. And I'll give you a parallel example of what I think might happen and what could be a model for what they could do. In 1962, there was a rally in Madison Square Garden, and it was organized by conservatives, by the Young Americans for Freedom, if anyone remembers them, which was then a new group. They'd been formed in 1960 by Buckley and company were superintending it. And they had a big rally in Madison Square Garden about conservatism and how Conservatives would liberate the world. And they'd had similar rallies before then that nobody really showed up for. They were 5,000 people, 6,000 people. This one in March drew 18,000 people. And there were protesters and picketers outside. So the Times ran a page one story that said something like 18,000 rightists, a term we don't even use anymore, rally in Madison Square Garden. And in the first line it said a spectacular rally of conservatives were there. Barry Goldwater spoke, and various journalists, including some at National Review, the conservative magazine. You know what the Times did after that? They went to one of their very few female reporters at the time, a great reporter named Nan Robertson, and sent her out across America to report on student activism, because the term everybody had been using was silent generation. That rally put that term to rest. She came back, she went to Madison, Wisconsin. She went to Grinnell College, a little college in Iowa, which is my alma mater. She went to Texas, she went to Oklahoma. They did a big series. Each story, I believe, ran on page one of the Times. And what she found was there were more students on the left than there were on the right, but nobody had known about any of them. And so what I would say is that's what the Times should have been doing all along. Instead of digging through Donald Trump's income taxes, go out into the country and see what the people have to say, what they're responding to. He led the campaign the entire way. I saw a clip on MSNBC, Keith Ellison, this quite gifted a member of the House of Representatives who I think is thinking of running to head the DNC. And they showed a clip of him more than a year ago on one of the morning shows, I think George Stephanopoulos' show, saying, do not underestimate this guy. He can win. And you see everybody laughing at him on the panel. And Ellison's African American. I think he might be Muslim. And he said, you know, you can laugh, but this guy is saying something. That was the cue not to follow Trump around and wait outside the Trump Plaza. It was to go to Iowa, to Wisconsin, to Ohio, to Michigan, to Florida. Look at that map. You can do it. Advantage of Google. If you draw a line from Philadelphia to Boise, Idaho, and look at that huge chunk there, Trump went all but like 4 states. It's 2,441 miles. That's an advantage of Google. They'll measure it out for you. That is what should have been written about. And from both sides. Hillary Clinton paid the price for that too. You can look at her speeches. She went to Michigan and talked about advanced technology, right? Advanced manufacturing, how you can take plants, get people doing more up-to-date jobs, right? All of this. It just wasn't being talked about. It was all the personal life, all the scandal, all the gossip, who said what to whom. It's what we know in journalism. It's chasing the story. Oh my gosh, Politico got it out first. We've got to come back and get one that gets ahead of them. How come we weren't on top of that story? Well, there's a bigger story unfolding. Right? It unfolded against what one of my heroes, John Updike, called this great country, and it was ignored.
Well, I think that there's a lot of truth to that. I think I'd push back a little bit on the idea that I actually think that the National Press Corps, the political press corps, was a factor this go round and was very hard on both candidates. Really did actually a pretty thorough inquiry into both of the candidates, damaged both of them very significantly, and in the way that they probably should, the reporters should do, and very unlike what happened in 2012 or 2008. In 2008, it's actually true that Barack Obama got a big pass from the media. That's actually a fact, that folks kind of fell in love with him. In 2000 and in the Clinton campaigns, the media also to some degree fell in love with Clinton, but then it worked against President Clinton because they were sort of called to account for it, and the media actually overcompensated for its affection for him and then became more ruthless about Clinton than they naturally would have been. But I actually think that after two election cycles in which the national media was largely irrelevant to the presidential elections, and some of you may have heard me say that to journalists here at this table, I think they came back this year and they actually really were a factor. I think you're right that the unwinding, as George Packer calls it, is a story that could have and probably should have been written about more and differently. But also, he was not leading the whole way. You know, in reality, it seemed that, the victims of the unwinding maybe were going to gravitate toward this Democratic candidate.
Well, he was leading the Republicans.
The Republicans, yes.
All the way through.
Right.
And also it was always very close with Clinton. So it's a little bit like the Brexit vote. You know, it was very close all along. Only the sentimental tide pushed the other way. An interesting thing I've been thinking about that I may write about is because my interests are historical. There are fascinating moments that happened in the Johnson and Nixon years. There's a famous moment some of you will know when Walter Cronkite went on television, said, "I've been to Vietnam, this war isn't going to be won." And Lyndon Johnson said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost America." And then you think, well, that's odd. A guy who sits in front of a television camera is the voice of America? I mean, is that really the way it's supposed to work? You know, we talk about the fears of authoritarianism and all the rest. Well, read your George Orwell. It's the people in front of the cameras who were actually the authoritarians. Not that Cronkite was, it's just by any means. But it shows you an odd dynamic was developing. Then in 1969, right after the call for the Vietnam moratorium, November 1969, Spiro Agnew gave a speech in Des Moines, Iowa, not far from where I went to college, if some of you remember this, attacking the three television networks. And the speech was mainly written by Pat Buchanan, who was a forerunner to Donald Trump in many ways, and with Nixon himself doing some of the editing. And he attacked the three major networks. If you remember, the speech is worth looking at for how he characterizes the media. He says something, I'm paraphrasing, he says, "Who are these men?" Of course, it's all men, who subject the president to instant analysis and querulous criticism. Because Nixon had given a big speech explaining his Vietnamization policy. It's great to be in a room where people actually remember some of the stuff. And then he said, "Who are they? Who are they?" And he said, "Well, we don't know." He said, "They seem to live in a part of the country that goes from New York to Washington. They live there." That's exactly the way it is now, all these years later, right? Well, then there's another essay that nobody looks at, but it interests me. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, right, the great Democrat who went and worked for Nixon, wrote a piece in Commentary magazine. It was published in March of 1970, I think, called "The Presidency and the Press." And it was an attack on the collusion between newspaper reporters mainly and leakers in government. And he said, what's going on when you read a report in the newspaper that says there's an internal dispute about policy? He said, I'll tell you what's going on, because he was the victim of a lot of reasons. He was mad about it. Somebody who lost the debate has, right? You did this. You were pro with this. Somebody who lost the debate called up a journalist and said, I'll tell you what went on in that meeting.
It was a knife fight.
Yeah, right, as we're hearing now. Oh, it's a Stalinist purge going on inside the Trump transition team. Where do you think they're getting that from? They're getting that from the people who lost. And Moynihan said, you know what? He said, this actually may not be the best thing for our democracy. And he said another thing that really sticks with me. He said, what happened is journalists, and Moynihan was almost, he's a little bit like Tom Wolfe, who was a friend of his. He's almost like a kind of satirist. And he said, well, journalists used to be these kind of pudgy guys who smoked cigars and came into newsrooms and tapped out their stories and nobody cared about them. He said, but they don't think of themselves that way anymore. They think of themselves as being part of an elite. They're part of the governing class. Now, there'd always been Joe Alsops and Walter Lippmanns and James Restons who really were like that, who lived in huge houses and, in Chevy Chase and went to parties with secretaries of state. There'd always been some of that. But now there was a bigger group, and it was kind of adversarial, came a little bit more out of the left. About a month after that story ran, or maybe even at the same moment, that essay by Moynihan, Daniel Ellsberg was leaking his stuff, the Pentagon Papers. Now, Moynihan couldn't know that. He was doing it, but he was leaking the papers. And the Times later reacted to all of that. They gave a column to William Safire, who may be the most gifted columnist the paper ever had. And you would see, and they had an op-ed page now, and you'd see pieces by people like Pat Buchanan suddenly were writing for them. Because there was a consciousness on the part of the press that whether or not they were being treated fairly by their adversaries in government or Republicans and conservatives, that nevertheless it was happening. Well, that was followed almost instantly by Watergate. And Watergate was the great triumph of a kind of adversarial investigative journalism, also conducted by people who seemed to be part of a new elite. And I think a lot of our politics and media has been about that battle ever since, and it's never really gone away.
But where that's going to go is going to be very hard to predict. It's obvious that left to our devices, Sam and I would be here the rest of the day. But I think we have to call it for time.
Oh, we didn't lock the doors? We didn't make them a captive audience?
But if you want to ask him another question, grab him.
I'll try to keep it short.
Grab him in. But let's grab him in the ante room while he's signing books. But there are books available. But thank you again.
Thank you.
That was awesome.
Great, it was fun.